Nothing like a good Timmy's run in the morning, eh? Well, I was just going for a cruise in this, and I came across you. You just can't get enough of this car stuff, can ya, you little hoser? Well, today I'm feeling extra patriotic because we have a very Canadian car. This is my 1962 Chrysler Saratoga. And this is a fascinating car to me. It's always been one of my bucket list cars, a 62 Chrysler. But this one, the Saratoga, is a little bit unique because they only sold the Saratoga in Canada in 1962. This car came at the end of an era for Chrysler. That was the forward look era, headed by a brilliant designer named Virgil Exner. The Chrysler Motor Company started off the 50s to a pretty slow start. There were companies like Ford and GM, and they were coming out with brand new designs and fun and exciting models, but Chrysler was kind of the stodgy old man's car. So they needed to spruce things up. In comes Virgil Exner. So they hired Mr. Exner to create exciting new designs. Starting in 1955, the forward-look Mopars had arrived. In my personal opinion, I think that some of these forward-look cars from the late 50s are some of the most beautifully designed and coolest cars to ever roll out of Detroit. Some of my personal favorites are 58 Plymouth, 56 DeSoto, and the 55 Chrysler. But then the market started to shift. Starting around 1960, cars started to tone down the wild and crazy designs of the 50s and move towards a more sporty, conservative look. Now, Chrysler cars went through a very awkward puberty, you might say, during this period. The cars started to get stranger and stranger and stranger. For most people, this is not their cup of tea. But for me, I think these are some of the wackiest, weirdest designs, and that's what draws me to them. My favorite design feature about this car are the headlights. In 1958, the American government mandated quad headlights. And so some manufacturers chose to stack them on top of each other, whereas other manufacturers put them side by side. But on the 62 Chrysler, it's like they couldn't decide, so they just kind of put them at a 45-degree angle. Very unique, very strange, but I think it makes it look super menacing, angry. Coming around the back, the fins from the 1961 Chrysler are gone and replaced with this modest, sort of rounded curve. I guess there's sort of a little fin here still, but I actually prefer the 62 over the 61 just because it's so odd. It was a transitional year, you might say, and 62 is regarded as the last year of the forward look. Another odd feature about this car are the crowns. There's so many crowns on this car. Let's count them. Wow, that's a lot of crowns. I mentioned that this is a Canadian car, and that's because from 1961 onwards, the Saratoga name was only sold in the Canadian market. The Saratoga had the larger 383. It also had some extra chrome bits and pieces, and it has the larger back glass window, not found on some of the other Chryslers. For being a Canadian car, it has a very American name. Saratoga is a place in New York State where a very pivotal battle in the Revolutionary War took place. The name Saratoga actually comes from Iroquois, and it means scum that floats on the water. I've done quite a bit of research on this car, so let me tell you what I know about its history. Well, here's a pretty obvious giveaway. The dealer badge. Back in the 60s, they didn't put stickers, they put nice metal badges to display which dealership it came from. This one came from Penner's in Steinbach, Manitoba. So I guess it was a Mennonite car. After quite a bit of research and digging, I was able to contact some of the original owners and hear their stories and piece together the story of this car. It's actually a really cool story, and there's a theme: fathers and sons, and their passion for this car. The original owner purchased this car new and drove it around for about a decade or so, and then it changed hands. And the second owner drove it around through the 1970s, and his brother was always jealous because he fancied the car. Now, the second owner's nephew knew that his dad really liked the car, and so he acquired it, and he did a full-blown restoration in the 1980s. I actually talked to him about it, and he was kind enough to send me some photos and tell me some of the stories about how it was repainted. It used to be two-tone white, and then it was repainted, so it was all red, and then it was actually repainted again to what it is now, with red and a white roof. But this car has always been the colors of the Canadian flag. Very patriotic. It went through a full-blown restoration at that time. The undercarriage was completely gone through and coated. The interior was stripped out and put back in after it was cleaned up. I think he replaced a couple of door panels, but the seats are original. Another thing that's original is the mileage. Still 59,000 original miles, and I verified that with all of the owners. It's pretty cool, very low mileage car. During the restoration, the motor and transmission both came out and they were rebuilt. When the car was finished the restoration, he gave it to his father, who loved the car. He drove it all the way from Manitoba to Vancouver Island in British Columbia. And this car has also been to Arizona. He took it on a road trip down there and then drove it back up to British Columbia. And then unfortunately he passed away. And his wife didn't give it to his son, but she sold it. The car changed hands a few more times. It remained on Vancouver Island, and eventually it ended up with this young guy, super nice, super into cars, and he took it on as a project with his father and grandfather. So his grandfather, father, and son all working on this car together. And then he sold it to me. I had a bunch of wiring and the dash fixed, so pretty much everything works. And then I started to drive it, and I still do to this day. I drove this car about 100 miles to get out to this beautiful landscape where we are right now in Agassiz, British Columbia. And that's all the history that I know about this car. But unfortunately, it's time for this car to go to its next owner, and maybe it's you. Underneath the hood, we have the venerable 383 V8, paired with a 3-speed automatic TorqueFlite transmission. Now, this engine and transmission combo is pretty bulletproof. The 383 was in so many vehicles. In 62, this was the second largest motor that you could get in a Chrysler. And at factory, it delivers about 305 horsepower. Underneath this hood, the thermostat has been replaced. The hoses, looks like the plug wires have. I know the spark plugs have. Valve cover gaskets, filters, battery. Basically all the maintenance stuff has been done, and she runs like a champ. Oh, belts too. Here we are, inside the belly of the beast. The interior on this car is super cool. There's a bunch of really weird little quirks that you don't really find in other vehicles, like this right here. The front seat has this little raised section for the driver. No headrest or anything like that, but the driver gets an extra inch of support for his back. Oh, I found another crown too. The dash of this car is really cool. Starting with this nice padded dash for safety, of course. We have the mirror mounted to the dash. Not up here, but it's down here. It's kind of strange. Some other Chrysler cars did this, but it's not very useful. The steering wheel's pretty cool. It's very large, very thin, and it's actually not a perfect circle, which is also kind of strange. You can see that the clear section up top is starting to deteriorate a little bit, so I'll probably throw a perforated leather wrap around it eventually. But then we get to the gauge cluster. This is called the Astrodome. Chrysler used this from 60 to 62 with a couple small little changes. But the Astrodome is a very complex system for the 1960s. It doesn't use a backlighting or bulbs or anything like that. It's called electroluminescence. It's kind of like those fish way down in the sea and they like glow in the dark. It's like that. So at nighttime, it looks really, really cool. Also in the gauge cluster, we have things like power antenna, dome light, map light, and rear window defrost. Only AM radio in this car. I guess FM wasn't really popular back then. Another cool thing is the push button transmission. A lot of modern cars use this, but Chrysler was doing it back in the 60s and even as early as the 50s. So if you want to shift it into drive, you just push a button. Because of that, there's no park. So if you want to stop, you put it in neutral and you put down the emergency brake. And when you do that, a little red lion lights up in the dashboard letting you know that your emergency brake is on. Just below that, we have the turn signals. It's not on the steering wheel like you would find in a normal car. It's off to the side and it's a little lever that you move from left to right. We also have a small clock, but unfortunately it's always 5:37. To open the door from the inside, you pull back, and then to lock it, you push forward. The heater in this car is so good. Maybe it was just colder in the 1960s, but for one reason or another, they knew what they were doing with this heater. The paint on this car is not perfect by any means. There are blemishes, there's bubbling in some places. After all, it was restored in the 1980s, so the paint is starting to show its age. It does look quite good from 5 feet away though. It's only when you get up close and personal that you start to notice that this car is definitely a driver. With that being said though, it is a driver, and I'm not afraid to take this car out and drive. If it gets a little scratch here and there, it's not the end of the world. This car was meant to be driven, and drive it I shall. I feel confident to drive this car for hundreds of miles at a time. The gas tank has been replaced, as well as the battery and hoses and other perishable items. It also has newer tires. They're just over a year old now. The white walls are not real, they're porta walls, but that allows for radial tires, which definitely improves the driving experience. The frame of this car is quite solid, but I wish I could say the same for the floors. I had to repair a pretty big hole just by putting a patch on it. If you want to see that, I'll put the link to that video below. Well, there you have it. That's been a brief overview of my 1962 Chrysler Saratoga. I'm really going to miss driving this car every day, but there's always other project vehicles that require my time and attention and money. And so unfortunately, she's got to go. With that being said, I got to get to work.